You kind of volunteer for it with us. Yes, I think we do. What do they do?
Well, the main thing is,
Until the end of it.
Oh, we accept calls.
The family is living early. They are living April 12th. How is it? Good.
Yeah.
the end of the night, yeah. But anyway, so then we have like breakfast.
Cool. I'll call you.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I still have to see I don't do it, but really there.
We do, we are,
Oh, is it? Okay. So you're like, oh, do you have passport?
yes,
Yes.
yes, we're paying.
Thank you very much.
Because if online, we can get extra programs. Okay, Claire, I'm gonna follow up on that.
Yes, please, just send me.
I will.
That'd be great.
No interest, thank you.
You want presentation?
All right, wonderful.
So you don't get your own projection.
So, what are you gonna do when this is over?
You can run it. Alma, do we need to tell those folks? Chris? Mike? 1 minute, we got 1 minute. So are you guys going in this order?
Martín, me,
Martín is first.
Good.
Yes.
I was waiting for them. They're probably sleeping still.
So it's Martín. You're number one. Yeah. I had a chance to talk to us. It's not yours. You're the speaker. You're the one. Stay right there.
Thank you.
We find out about the deer also, because the deer was another backup.
I thought they all.
I'm like,
That's for the speaker. You can have it if you like. Oh. Oh, okay. We'd like to welcome you today to our final Cronkite Global Conversations for this academic year. There's always a tinge of sadness when we come to the end of this series of speaker events, because we know it's not too much longer before Humphrey Fellows will be leaving for vast, wonderful experiences in other parts of the United States. But we treasure the time that we have with them as we are grateful for their time. And today we're going to finish up with a really timely topic. First of all, let me welcome those who have come to join us. And if you're watching us online, we appreciate that. Cronkite Global Initiatives is part of a larger project that we do here at the school to help our students, faculty, and staff be able to see the world, know the world, and understand the world. There certainly is nothing more complex than the concept of governments at war with the media. It is extremely timely. We're going to hear some perspectives from around the world, but I suggest by the time we get to the Q&A, it might cut a little closer to home. Hubert H. Humphrey was, of course, the vice president under Lyndon Johnson, chose, when he didn't win, and Richard Nixon did, he could have retired, but instead he went back into the United States Senate, continued his distinguished career of service that started in the late 1940s. And then when he passed away, President Jimmy Carter created Humphrey programs around his great legacy of work. And two of our fellows are actually going to Emory University next week and will be meeting and shaking hands with President Carter, which is exciting. All of our Humphrey Fellows were inside the U.S. State Department building. It's a beautiful Ben Franklin building as part of the Global Leadership Forum. And that's just part of one of the many things they do during the Humphrey year. And perhaps one of the most memorable things they do is get to know you, whether it's host families, friends, faculty who serve as mentors, teachers, great professors like John Meisner who guide them in their fine-tuning their leadership as they get ready to head out the door. I'm going to get off the stage because it's important that we hear from them. Martín Aguirre from Uruguay is up first, and I thank you for your participation. Look forward to your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bill. So, good morning. I don't know if at this time we say good morning or
I don't know either. That's a good question. Good noon.
So our subject here, our issue was war on media and governments at war with media. And basically, when we started talking about this with Daneel and Bopha, the idea was that when we arrived to Phoenix, to the US, we felt this kind of strange climate between government and the media and this clash and confrontation environment everywhere. And it reminded us a lot of some things we've been experiencing in our own countries. And we thought that maybe we could share our experiences and maybe there was some lessons that everybody could get about this, or at least from the knowing that you're not alone. There are some similar things going on in some other places, so that could be helpful to have a better picture. Also, the other thing I wanted to say first is that I'm not focusing on Uruguay's situation particularly because Uruguay has a very peculiar situation in the region. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but I thought it was more interesting and more insightful to focus on the region where the problems are far more serious than they look in my own country. So, the guy we're all talking about is probably going to be around during the three presentations, but basically, the Trump phenomenon is what's triggering all these comments and all these discussions about media and the relation with the government. And why it's important now? Because, I mean, Bopha has said it a couple of times, most of the governments of the world look at the US as like an example or a place where they can look and know exactly what they can do and what they are. It's not acceptable to do in their relationship with the media. So the Trump revolution or the Trump phenomenon is impacting way further than the US, and it's having an impact in the whole world in that matter. And the other thing that I thought it was interesting was because Trump has described himself and his movement as conservative populism. And populism is something that is very extended, particularly in Latin America. And it's strange because usually it's an adjective that people feel with guilt. They don't proclaim to be populist openly like we've seen with Trump. So I think that was a particularly interesting thing to say. And what are the main characteristics of a populism government? Well, basically, there are a lot of descriptions of what that means, but the main characteristic is that the populist leader has a straight relation with its people. It tries to avoid the middleman. And in that matter, the first victim usually is the media and the press, because it's usually somebody that tries to adapt his message into certain characteristic and that he usually doesn't like. So it's usually unavoidable that populist leaders have usually a problem with the media. And Latin America has a PhD in populism. Right? Most of the main characteristics of a populist leader have been developed after Latin American leaders. Here we have 4 of them. I just chose this one. Is called Anastasio Somoza. He was the leader of Nicaragua for many, many years. Very interesting person. He also had some characteristics that you might find interesting. That's everyone. Getulio Vargas, who was a very important president of Brazil in the 20th century, and also one of the figures around what a populist definition has been created. Velasco Alvarado from Peru. He was a military dictatorship in the 70s. Particular one because in that time most of the military coups were from the right wing, trying to stop the communist governments or communist movements to get to power. But he was a left-wing military dictatorship, and he did some crazy things. And of course, Mr. Juan Domingo Perón from Argentina and Evita, who is probably like the quintessential figure of populism. One thing is that populism definition doesn't mean bad or good. In the last couple of years, there's been like a rediscovery of the term, and some people say it's not necessarily good. It's some form of leadership that can represent people that usually are not represented in the political landscape. But the other good, interesting thing is that it can be from the left, from the right, or like Perón, from you will never find out where. So, what's the situation in Latin America? Starting in 2000, there has been a new wave of populist leaders in the region. They define themselves as nationalistic, basically Pan-American, I would say the word, because they have tried to develop like a new alliance among all the countries. And their speech, it's very confrontational with the old regime, and particularly with the press. They all have had big problems with the press. And they have another interesting characteristic that is, while in the US, usually when everybody accuses Trump of blaming Mexicans or Muslims for all the problems in the country, these guys and their ideological background usually blames the US about all of our problems. So that's one characteristic. And the other one is that while in the US Trump complains that media it's mostly liberal and it has a bias against conservatives, in Latin America it's the opposite. I mean, the left-wing governments complain that the media are right-wing and they have bias against them particularly. So during this decade of new populist leadership, you have to remember that Latin America is one of the most violent and unequal regions in the world. Probably the most unequal and violent, and if you're not the first, it's the second. If you see the map, this is the map of Reporters Without Borders about the most dangerous countries in the world to be a journalist. You have Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, Latin America, but also the rest of the countries are not in a very good situation, except Uruguay and Chile, probably. The rest are in a very bad position. So these governments confronted directly with the media system in their countries. Almost all of them sponsored deep reforms in the legal regulation of the media. And right now, after this decade, Latin America is probably one of the most dangerous regions in the world to be a journalist. Maybe not because of those reforms. It wasn't a very nice place to be a journalist before, but that definitely hasn't helped. So I'm going to focus in 4 cases or 4 examples. The first one is Venezuela. Venezuela was the first government to start this trend of populist governments. Chavez, who was the president, Hugo Chavez, ruled from 1999 to 2013, when he died from a cancer illness. And with a short interval when there was a coup that threatened to take him out of power. He had an extremely bad relation with the press. I mean, you can see all kinds of videos on the internet of him confronting journalists from CNN, from the local media. And he started the trend of, for example, with Twitter. He was probably the first one that started the Twitter trend between the presidents. And also he had his own show, which was called Aló Presidente, which could last up to 7 hours once a week, or maybe 3 times a week, where he did all kinds of things. He nationalized most of the media, or had them bought by close associates that were benefiting from state money. He shut down many TV signals. He nationalized their equipment. He did all kinds of things. Until right now, the situation in Venezuela for the press is probably the worst in the region. There's only one newspaper that remains that's not completely in favor of the government, and almost no TV signal. I had the chance to go to cover when he died, his funeral in Venezuela, which was a really amazing experience. And watching TV, it was amazing because he was portrayed as a new Christ. I mean, all kinds of cult of the propaganda and the cult of the personality was something that you could never imagine. And right now, Venezuela is in the place 137 from 180, according to Reporters Without Borders. I have a short video here of what he did in those 8 hours, but I think it can be a little bit.
Y pase lo que pase, en cualquier circunstancia, seguiremos teniendo patria.
And he,
Patria perpetua, dijo Borges.
I agree.
he started to sing, but I think it's too late.
It's nice, the singing part.
No. So, second country, Ecuador. This guy is very nice, breaking newspaper, which was one of his favorite pastimes. Rafael Correa. He was the president for 10 years, and that's wrong. It was president until 2 years ago, for 10 years. And in 2013, he sanctioned a new communication law that Human Rights Watch called an open attack on the freedom of speech. In the first year, 200 stations were sanctioned. The law demanded really crazy things. For example, you wouldn't work as a journalist if you didn't have a special authorization from the government. 2 years of jail for anyone who offended the president. There were many newspapers that were sold, they were closed down. Also, the same thing that happened in Venezuela, people that had business with the government were starting to buy the newspapers or the media that were opposed to the government and turn them into a complete propaganda outlets. And even like the biggest newspaper in Ecuador, which was called El Comercio, was bought at some point by this very shady figure. Nobody knows exactly his face or where he gets his money, but he lives in Miami. He's from Guatemala, Mexico. They call him the Phantom, and he's buying media in Latin America in the last 10 years like crazy.
Oh.
And his strategies never confront with the government. So Ecuador also, it's in the 105 spot on Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, which is not a very nice place to be, but this is also interesting.
It's ripped up newspapers that have criticized it. A quick word about Ecuador. Ecuador's president is Rafael Correa, a charismatic leader who once a week does an address to the nation he calls Citizen League, where, as you'll see, some amazing things can happen. Yes, that is an address to the nation. In fact, every presidential speech from now on should have somewhere within it, in brackets, clown enters. To attack people he feels.
Let's see that. So the next one in the line, Argentina. Well, I'm from Uruguay, so when it comes to Argentina, I'm not exactly objective, but Argentina is very passionate and they do everything like multiplied for 10. So their relation with the media was especially difficult. This nice couple here are Cristina Fernandez and Néstor Kirchner, who run the country from 2003 to 2015. He was elected president first, but since there was no election, he put his wife as a president, something that's very practical. They had a really bad relation with the media, particularly with the two biggest newspapers, which are Clarín and La Nación. It was an open war, and they sponsored this kind of campaigns where they pay the ultras in the football teams to post signs, huge signs saying that the newspaper is lying. The government owns part of the stock of one of these newspapers, and the video is in YouTube. One of the ministers went into a stock assembly or board meeting with boxing gloves and saying, well, who's going to vote whatever, because you're going to do what I want to do. They were linked with a union, so at some point they sent the unions to stop the circulation of the newspapers. It was an absolutely open war. And in the end, the government changed 1 year ago, but Argentina is now 50 in the ranking and improved 5 places since they left. But anyway, the scars of this war are still very present in Argentina, and that's something I'm not talking about in the conclusion. And the last one is Uruguay. Uruguay is a particular case because according to Reporters Without Borders, the country is a model for freedom of information. And it's really difficult for Uruguay to compare us with the region because we have been historically very different to the region. And if you compare us with Argentina or with Ecuador or Venezuela, you would think you're in paradise. But the truth is, we have to compare with ourselves, and our situation in the last years has been going down and in a very worrisome way. These are two presidents in this period, Tabaré Vázquez and José Mujica. José Mujica is a very peculiar person. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but it's like Trump, just from the other side. He's from the left wing, but he has all the things that you see about Trump. He manages the media cycle like anybody. He can say whatever and people don't care. And he has a huge popularity, even though he has done the most amazing stuff you would imagine. And Mr. Vázquez, who's now president, and he, as you see, a nice exchange with somebody there. It's funny because like 48 hours ago, there was a national, we call it Cadena Nacional. It's like a program that the government has the right to do and demands all the TV channels and all the radios to broadcast it at the same time. 30 minutes, and he paid to a former anchor of TV, like Cronkite or something like that, to talk in his name for 30 minutes saying how good the government is going. And also we found out that they made an open call for private companies to do a following of the media, and they not only want to know what the media says, but the tone of the media. And we don't know exactly what's that for. But in these countries also there's a big tool that governments use to pressure media, and that is public. Most of the big companies are owned by the state, like the electricity company, the water company, the telephone, and they are advertising. It's like a huge part of the media income. So what they do is that through that they can control or pressure the media so that they don't have a very aggressive discourse against it. So finishing conclusion. As I said, we feel that we've been here before, some of us for a long time, some for a short time. It's not something ideological. I think it's a problem that's a sign of the times, probably has to do with the communication revolution, I don't know, but it seems that the people are wanting this kind of leaders that break with the establishment and they say things that until before them it was not acceptable to say, but everything is forgiven for them and they can go against every reasonable argument without having to pay a political price for that. The second lesson that I think is important, especially after what happened in Argentina, is that the media cannot lose their focus on what's their mission in a country. In Argentina, Clarín was the biggest newspaper. It was selling like almost 1 million newspapers every Sunday. And after the war with the government, it lost almost more than half of that because they were not credible. They were in an open war with the government, and the government changes, but the media loses its reputation, and then you have nothing. And I'm seeing some stuff here with the media it's worrying me about that. I mean, I saw a piece in CNN talking about how many hours of golf did Trump play. I mean, is that really the role of the media to do that? It's kind of dangerous. The same thing with the Apple's advertising. It's kind of not what we should do, I think. And the last lesson is that since in our region, in the last 2 or 3 years, most of these governments have changed. And even if they belong to the same party, their relation with the media has changed a lot. So that's like the optimistic note in which I want to finish my presentation, is that there is hope. And that we have an expression in Spanish that every time it rained, eventually it stopped. So, you can only trust that the people gain some sort of consciousness, and some of the most crazy things you're seeing today eventually would stop and normality would come back.
Thank you, Martín. That was excellent. We're going to move straight through, and all these questions come at the end. So we'll flip to the other side of the world. There we go.
Thank you, Dr. Bill. Thank you, Martín. Now let's go to Cambodia. So, first of all, I want to bring you to the history of news in Cambodia. So these are newspaper, Cambodian newspaper and English newspaper. So I would say among all these newspapers, the only 2 independent newspapers was at the Cambodia Daily and Phnom Penh Post. And then we have many TV and radio stations, but all of the TV stations are government affiliated, so they don't really broadcast anything that critical about the government. So anything big you want to see, or anything critical or expose corruptions about the government, they want to see it on, or you want to see it on the TV in Cambodia. So these are the number of the journalists that got killed. What I remember is Mr. Kamsabo, he was killed. He worked for a very, very critical newspaper. He got killed in 2008 while he was driving motorbike with his son. So both of them got shot and died instantly on the road. So what often they say is that be careful if you are a journalist. The easy way to get rid of you is an accident. So every day I go to the office and I'm worried about coming back home. Somebody created an accident that could kill me. So and the rest that died recently, for example, Mr. Sun Chan and Tang Tri, he was like a freelancer. He looked into illegal logging and he got killed. So these are the journalists that got killed in my country from 1990s until late 2000. And me, I was lucky. So the lady sitting over there, that was me, and that is my colleagues. So this guy got killed when all of us went to investigate illegal logging. And I was lucky. I sat behind him. He died, but yeah. And the fact that he got killed because he's working on he tried to investigate to reveal the illegal logging in Cambodia. And this is the Minister of Information, so he controls media. Now a lot of media, independent media, having a hard time to get license. For example, Radio Free Asia or Voice of America. We are not sure whether they're gonna get that or not. It's up to them. So my case, on top of got shot at one, I got detained once too for the investigation. And often my Prime Minister talk in public threatening those who make comment on any kind of report or situations in Cambodia. So he would say, "You guys careful, you guys don't know anything." So this guy, he's a very famous, smart Cambodian who got educated in the US. And a lot of Cambodian, especially journalists, rely on him to give comment because we all think that he's the only person who has passport, American passport. And in case anything happened to him, he could always get a ticket and fly away. And the rest, they could face big consequence. And you never know. So he's a director of a think tank in Cambodia. After Prime Minister's return to talk to sue him, he's stopped talking to the journalists. But of course, there's still people who want to talk to the journalists. 2016, the Global Witness released a report saying that the family of Prime Minister have at least $200 million in his business. And he has claimed to the media that he makes less than about 10,000 per year. If you make that much money, how could you have like 200 million, right? When this report came out, no one talked to the journalists, none. Not Mr. Aguirre, who just got threatened, none. But there's one brave man, and his name is Cambodia. So the media like Phnom Penh Post and like Cambodia Daily, we wrote a story about. So then the next day, this is the son of the Prime Minister. He's saying that the media like Phnom Penh Post and Cambodia Daily cooperate with the NGO to kill the government. And then they circulate this on Facebook. So a few days, so this is the guy who I'm telling you is brave to talk to the journalists. He gave a VOA and Radio Free Asia a full kind of interview explaining that it's impossible that you have $200 million if you're not doing a proper business, right? If you are doing a proper business, if you did not corrupt. So the easy way is that the government step out and explain why you have $200 million in business. a few days after he made the comment, he got shot at and died instantly in a coffee shop at around 9:30 or something, or 10 in the middle of the Phnom Penh city. And that is his wife could only see him from outside. So the police did not even allow her to see the guy. And this is his funeral. He talked, because in Cambodia, Cambodian people rely so much on Radio Free Asia and VOA to get the information. And this guy, his name Daneel, he's often talked to Radio Free Asia and VOA, so a lot of Cambodian people heard of his name, and he's like all the Cambodians love him. So when he died, all the Cambodians came out and joined the funeral. But this funeral, I was told that it lasts about 7 kilometers, and his house where his body was brought to, usually if you drive in a normal speed, it would take only 1.5 hours and 2 hours. So I was covering the story back then for Voice of America, and it took me from 8 o'clock until 6 p.m. in the evening. But the media report nothing about it. And the next day, the Cambodia Daily wrote the story about how the government media did not report on this. So I just want to show you a little bit about the funeral, so you can see. So government media did not report it. Didn't see it. They said 300 to 500 So this is the craziest thing I have ever seen in my life. So yeah, and then this is just the photos of the procession. Oh, I will show this. So let's talk. After that thing happening, this is what this is like the things that really cause what's happening in Cambodia right now. I want to show you this.
Since you're attacking us, can you give us a question? Since you're, no, Mr. President-elect, Mr. President-elect, since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a chance? You are attacking our news organization. Can you give us a chance to ask the question, sir? Go ahead. Sir, can you state, Mr. President-elect, can you state categorically, Mr. President-elect, can you give us a question? You are attacking us. Can you give us a question? Can you give us a question? Can you state categorically? You are fake news. Sir, can you state categorically that nobody, no, Mr. President-elect, that's not appropriate.
So let's see. I want to show you how this affects countries like Cambodia and other part of the world.
If you want to discover the source of the division in our country, look no further than the fake news and the crooked media, which would rather get ratings and clicks than tell the truth.
President Trump often hits back at coverage he doesn't like. He's used the term fake news in no fewer than 180 tweets since Inauguration Day, as well as in countless speeches, interviews, and comments. Press freedom activists say Trump's strategy is having an effect.
And he's very eager to have Twitter, mainstream news organizations pick up his tweets and write about them and amplify them. So he is in one regard pretty sophisticated about this, in that he is he's using the very press that he is denigrating and is very sensitive to, and gets quickly irritated by anything he sees in the press that he's already decried as fake.
This is an apple.
Stung by the attacks on their integrity, major media outlets have come up with new slogans and ad campaigns like CNN's Apple to defend themselves. Press watchdog groups say authoritarian leaders are following Trump's lead.
We saw the term fake news being used in the Philippines, in Russia, in China, in Egypt, to justify their own repression of the media, their own attempts to delegitimize journalists. So we've also seen China saying, hey, the US is finally waking up to what we've been saying this whole time about, the media being problematic. And that's not what we want to see around the world.
China's top cybersecurity official recently cited fake news to defend against a report ranking China last in the world in internet freedom.
Even countries like the United States and Europe, everyone's discussing it together, like with these new media, these fake news, rumors, this kind of raging problem. How should we deal with this? We are all facing this together.
The phenomenon is spreading. Syria's President Bashar al-Assad dismissed human rights reports about deaths in military prisons by saying, we live in a fake news era. Authoritarian leaders from Thailand's Prayut Chan-o-cha to Cambodia's Hun Sen and Malaysia's Najib Razak have talked about fake news. Singapore is said to be considering a fake news law in the new year.
That has seemed to embolden those leaders in thinking that what they're doing is acceptable, that they can get away with it, that there won't be chastising on the part of the US government.
Trump has welcomed several authoritarians to the White House. He hailed Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan as a friend, despite Turkey's reputation as the world's leading jailer of journalists. The Committee to Protect Journalists says the number of reporters jailed in 2017 hit an all-time high for the second year running. Peter Heinlein, VOA News, the White House.
Thank you. And then what happened? So after what he talked about, calling the CNN fake news or whatever, this guy is a spokesman for the government. He released it on, actually I could not find the old letter. So first he wrote it on his Facebook post saying President Trump thinks that the news reported by those organizations did not reflect the truth, which is the responsibility of the professional reporter. And he continued, this means that freedom of expression must respect the law and authority of the state. And then it's the attack on the freedom of the press in Cambodia start. This is what's going on. 1 month after I left Cambodia to come to the US, the newspaper where I used to work for 6 years, and the place where it writes anything critical about Cambodia, any article, got shut down, along with more than 15 other independent radio, which at that time kind of agreed with the Radio Free Asia and VOA to have distribute the news they make. So they shut down. So we don't have any, now we only have one independent English and Khmer newspaper. It's called the Phnom Penh Post. And we worried that the government might try to get some kind of excuse to shut it down. The 2 reporters were arrested and put in jail for espionage, and they say for being a spy, and they said this reporter working with the government, with the US government, trying to topple the Cambodian government. And my former colleague at the Daily also escaped the country and went to Thailand, and now he's got a refugee asylum, whatever, to live in Canada. And other 3 reporters escaped the country and came here. 100 more members of the opposition party left the country trying to find a new place to live. And this is a report from a reporter without body on.
It's certainly been
the situation of the media in Cambodia is not very good because the government trying to put pressure.
The case of Cambodia Daily is because of tax payment.
Yeah, beginning of August, I woke up one morning on a Saturday, logged into my Facebook and saw this tax bill for the Daily, $6.3 million that none of us had heard anything of.
Cambodia Daily is also a big case because of the active reporting and promoting freedom of expression in Cambodia.
But yeah, there was a fair amount of hope that this could be resolved in some way through legal channels or...
And also the case of previously the reporter of Cambodia Daily were also threatened as well.
So this is just an example of what's happening and help you to understand what's going on. So this is another example. Radio Free Asia, he's actually living in the US, and then he came to Cambodia to work on a story, and then he's like got threatened by the government that he had to escape the country again and came to the US. So I'm not sure what's going on with the future of the media in Cambodia and in the region.
Next, we'll go to South Africa with Daneel's experiences.
Okay, so thanks to my colleagues. I want to segue of what they were saying, and there's been a lot of outrage around Donald Trump over the last year, the run-up to the presidency, but there's been a sense around the rest of the world, as we've been hearing, like, welcome. His rise comes on the back of rising populism, authoritarian conservatism in leaders' approaches around the world, and in the sense generally, we've seen that with Brexit and with the anti-immigration sentiment across Europe, and with leaders like, Putin, Modi, Erdogan in Turkey, and specifically, if we're going to do cross comparisons, Jacob Zuma stands almost as a mirror image on many issues with Donald Trump. So my presentation is going to be a cross comparison, really. I think it's a time for the US to stop thinking what they can teach to the world, and maybe to take some introspection and to see what they can learn from other countries' experiences. Because as Martín, as Bopha said, we've been through some of what you guys are experiencing, specifically with the media before. So very quickly, I'm going to try to run through my points to keep to time. But just quickly, a profile of these two leaders. Both came from left field. Zuma was fired as deputy president. He had corruption charges. He had sexual assault, rape charges over his head. And he rose to win the candidacy for president and became president. He seemed like he was politically dead, kind of like Donald Trump came from left field, got the candidacy, got the presidency against expectation. Both accused of sexual assault. Zuma raped somebody and got acquitted. Nativism, populism, very much part of their ideology and what they kind of appeal to the grassroots in a sense. Politics of division, a lot of infighting in the party, a lot of divisiveness in their approach to communication and ruling. Self-enrichment in office is something I'll mention again, but we know about Trump and his hotels and Mar-a-Lago and all of that. Third-party interference in the state to benefit both the third party and the president. Russia, we had a private entity, the Gupta family, which enriched themselves through their relationship with the president, but also enriched the president and his associates. Lies, alternative facts, that's really the subject of this presentation and our themes. And then finally, attacks on the media. I want to go to my countryman Trevor Noah for
everything that you look at. Zuma and Trump even feel the same way about the media.
Even the media. They think they know me better. No, the people of this country know me better than they do.
And the media are among the most dishonest people anywhere at any time.
Okay, I'm not going to play the whole, we get the message, right? They feel the same about media. So before we look at today, I just quickly want to go back to our mutual history. This is kind of a cross comparison. What can we learn from one another's experiences? Both in South Africa and the United States, accountability journalism and holding power to account has got the deep kind of rootedness through the 20th century. It kind of started with the Nixon administration and the Nixon administration's animosity towards the Washington Post, New York Times around the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, but that kind of led into a new age of investigative journalism and holding power to account to the 20th century. In South Africa, it was a little bit more difficult. We had an authoritarian apartheid state, and yet we had some really, that's the old apartheid flag at the top. We had reporters holding the government to account, specifically on things like death squads is on the left, which was exposed in the late 80s and early 90s, and the deaths of activists in police custody, which the government was trying to spin. Yet, a lot of pressure on editors, banning of editors, etc. Post-apartheid, the media kind of reinvented itself and held the government, saw its role as holding the government accountable, and that was really seen firstly in countering the lies around AIDS denialism that President Thabo Mbeki was purporting. So, those histories are mutual. So I'm just quickly going to mention two things that have been thorns in the side of Jacob Zuma's presidency. The one has been investigative journalists exposing the state expenses on his private residence. They built swimming pools, amphitheaters, shops, cricket fields, and there were also supposedly security upgrades that were necessary for the president. This $25 million expenditure was exposed by investigative journalists and eventually taken up by independent institutions that called on the president to repay some of the money. It was just a constant embarrassment through his administration, especially the stonewalling and lying that went on around it. Then this Gupta family that I've mentioned, investigations into their reach within government. So it's just to make the point, journalism, investigative journalism has been really holding the Zuma presidency to account throughout, and kind of started on a note of animosity because of his corruption allegation and sexual harassment allegations that came up just at the beginning or prior to the beginning of his presidency. I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide and also just hark back to experiences you guys have had in the United States. I've put down 4 primary means of attack that Zuma presidency has employed against the press, and I think each one kind of corresponds, except for the one I'll mention, to what Trump has been saying and trying to do here. Each one corresponds to one of the cartoons. So the first is legislation. The government tries to push a secrecy bill through our parliament. Basically, it gives very broad discretion to classify material in the public, in the national interest, and then to attach prison terms of up to 25 years for journalists and whistleblowers that expose that material. This is an attempt at pushing a law through Parliament. Luckily, there was so much civil society outrage around this that they didn't quite succeed in pushing it, and there were amendments, and I think that bill is still kind of in process. We've seen Trump calling for stronger defamation laws, right? So trying to use laws, legislation. The second attempt has been, and this hasn't happened in the United States, and you guys are very happy, the capture of the public broadcaster. The public broadcaster is funded, in part, like in the US, by the government, and there's been a lot of political appointments. And yet it's got a really strong history of integrity in journalism. So a lot of the reporters were very upset with this and were dismissed and harassed and all of that. Sunshine journalism, that's kind of this cartoon we have there. You've got your Zuma appointee, Charlie Motsoeneng, saying to his journalists, we're not going to show any images of discontent in our news. We're going to just show that's Zuma handing over the keys to a new home to a beneficiary family. We're only going to show good news on our outlet, and that's directly to benefit Jacob Zuma's presidency. This issue that you've seen in the press here as well is propaganda and harassment. And you've kind of seen these Gupta leaks exposed a British PR company that were employed by the Guptas and the president to spew kind of racial divisiveness into society to distract from attention on the Zuma president's unscrupulous kind of. So you've kind of seen that with Trump as well, diverting and always speaking to the populist base and the common man and the working class and all that. Division, and then just plain thuggery. People, supporters of Zuma, attacking journalists, intimidating journalists. And one of the SABC journalists actually died of a syndrome called broken heart syndrome because of the pressure and the assaults, the violence and the harassment that she experienced. So, there are casualties in this assault. And finally, of course, lawsuits. Michael Wolff, you guys will remember the book Fire and Fury. We've had similar experiences where the president has tried to take a cartoonist, Zapiro, to court over an unflattering cartoon that he did, and also attempts by the State Security Agency to prevent the publication of books in the similar way that the president attempted to do that, President Trump, with Fire and Fury and Michael Wolff. So there's this similarity in the presidents of both Zuma and Trump's approach in a multi-pronged attack on the integrity of the media. So this is the kind of conclusion that I want to leave us with. What can we learn from these mutual experiences and these mutual trends that we've seen, and how do we survive beyond this assault on the freedom of the press and the legitimacy and the integrity of the press? This first slide speaks to two things. It speaks to the protection. The media does not exist in society in isolation. Its impact is contingent on other people taking the work forward and holding the president and his government accountable. The media cannot impeach a president, plainly. It cannot hold it accountable. The second point is that the media's freedom and right to exist is also contingent on other things within society. And the two most important things that we share between the United States and South Africa is the protection of the freedom of speech in our Constitution, right? Trump cannot amend the Constitution to take that out, nor could Zuma. And secondly, very importantly, the independence of the judiciary. And it's a little bit, because Trump's got such because the American president has such discretion to appoint, Supreme Court judges, right? It's a little bit more fraught here, but in South Africa, that was one of the institutions that was never captured by the Zuma lobby entirely. So he couldn't use the courts to steamroll over journalists, and luckily that's kind of protected the press. Then just going back to the institutional oversight of the president, the media can only go so far in reporting on malfeasance, corruption, and so on. Both in the United States and in South Africa, I feel like we have institutions, Robert Mueller and the Justice Department here. We've got something similar called the Public Protector's Office, which stands outside of government, but is funded. It's part of the constitutional framework of our country and funded by government, where ordinary people can lodge complaints for investigation. And Zuma has been investigated, and pretty bad findings have been published against him by this public protector, which he appointed, incidentally. And he's now appointed, well, just before he was recalled, which I'm turning to now. Then finally, an informed citizenry and a civil society. So what we've seen with Florida and the shootings and the debate of young people coming up and making their voices heard, appealing to legislators, appealing to the elected officials. That's something we've seen in South Africa as well, and it kind of comes out of the struggle against apartheid. There's a strong basis for civil society and for outrage within ordinary society. So I think that's very important for the press's impact to be felt. And finally, and this I put in brackets, ideally, the ability for parties to hold their presidents to account. We know that doesn't happen often, but it did happen. There is precedent for it. With Nixon, it was the Republican Party that said they were going to impeach him before he resigned. There's lone voices like Jeff Flake speaking out against the president's attacks on the media in the Republican Party, and a general feeling of unease within the Republican establishment. And finally, South Africa's ruling party recalled the president now recently. And that was kind of because all of this reporting was a death knell for his presidency, and they knew that they were going to lose out in the next elections if they kept him in until then. So it's really only for self-preservation, not really for the country's good, but the parties have this ability to. And then my final slide, the resilience of the media and the institution itself to survive this assault. And I think we need to look at our history and also our present and take a few lessons. The one is that as long as there's been corrupt officials, well, specifically through the 20th century, there's been a tradition within both countries to try and hold power to account. So we need to draw on those best experiences and not panic. We've been through similar challenges before in both countries. And secondly, adapting to changes and challenges in media sustainability, right? So Newspapers are a month away from closing down in South Africa currently, and Pulitzer Prize winning kind of local newspapers in the United States are closing down because of funding shortfalls. We need to adapt and make sure that our media and our investigative journalism is resilient to the challenges. Just doing the hard work of countering lies and fake news, I think that's, there's consensus on that. Finally, I want to just end on this note, and it's cautionary to the media. Maybe because it's so partisan here, it's not as evident. But in South Africa, definitely the media has kind of lost, and this is an accusation against the liberal establishment in media here, that they've lost touch with some concerns in working class communities. And that could be exploited by Trump and by Zuma to say, look at the East Coast liberal establishment, look at the white elitist media in South Africa, they're not speaking on your behalf. And that easily turns or alienates a significant segment of society. And I think the media needs to take that seriously. They need, when they're advocating the public interest, they need to make sure that the public interest is not too narrowly defined, and that they're speaking on behalf of a broad swath of society, so that this populist kind of rhetoric that turns people at the grassroots and in poor communities against the media, specifically in South Africa, is not perpetuated. So that is, in conclusion, I know we're almost out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
So let's fire away and take your questions. I think we could spend 2 hours on each of their countries and their complexities, but we don't have 2 hours. Martín, come join the foray. Who's got a question for you? Yes, all the way, Peter. The end of the table.
But I'm glad I got what I got. In South Africa, that secrecy bill.
Yeah.
You say it's still floating around?
You know what? I actually had to go into Wikipedia to try and see where it was at, because it's been really quiet. There was a lot of outrage about it, and I think the latest was that amendments were rejected by the president that were proposed by the National Assembly, and it was sent back to the National Assembly. And I actually couldn't find an update what happened after it was sent back to the National Assembly for reconsideration of these amendments. The legislative process is quite confusing sometimes. I know I'm a journalist, I should know it, but I actually don't know.
All right, great, thank you.
What do you think about the new president that just came in?
I'm sorry, because there was so much time pressure. Zuma was recalled. He was fired 2 weeks ago. The new president, he's much more media savvy. He's got a anti-corruption kind of gleam that he's putting on government, but it's largely assumed that he's speaking on behalf of capital interests, and that he's lip service to the poor communities, which really have lost out with the democratic transition, is not genuine. So I think there's still a space for accountability journalism and keeping the state in check, especially to its responsibilities to the poorest people that needed to gain from the democratic transition. I'm not convinced by him. That's the short answer.
Johanna? Right, go ahead.
It was a question for Bopha, actually. When you mentioned about the Cambodia daily being shut down and there was a tax demand of $6.5 million, were there any efforts made to kind of raise that money in order to sort of keep that newspaper up?
No, I don't think it's possible. And also, this is what the publisher is now really sick. He's like 90-something years old. He was actually a former reporter for like a very I forgot the name of the newspaper he worked here, but he won like a 1 or 2 Pulitzer Prize, and he's a good friend with the king. So the agreement is that he's gonna have the Cambodian people with school, so he build hundreds of schools across the country. But these things happen because he's now really sick too. He could not even speak, so now he's like more like a plan. And also the former king passed away. So it's a good time for the government to do that. And Cambodia Daily never make any profit. When I was working there, I start off with $350 per month, and then I worked there for 6 years, and later on I got like 700. So it's like it's not a reach. It's just be there in order to inform people what's going on, reveal some corruptions, and the main purpose is to train people like me to be a good journalist.
Awesome. Yes, Kazi.
Yeah, and this is also for actually Bopha. When you say that media is government is on war with media, it also kind of implies that media is kind of doing their job properly. So, like in Cambodia, there's so much going on last decade. So, how is the vibe among the journalists? Do they love it, like being a journalist in this time, or they're scared about their life and their work?
Often I got, now that before I was like trying to talk to my colleagues to be more brave, to ask the question, direct question, get the response. And I said like, we are the only people that can bring the truth to the table and so that the government could see it. But of course now after all these things happening, the Cambodia Daily shut down, more than 15 radios shut down too, and 2 journalists were arrested and put in jail, still in jail now. And I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this. Strangely, every now and then there's a bunch of guys roaming around our office, just like sitting there. And so my colleagues often like email me and express their concern, but I said, you guys have to be strong and do the job. But of course they are really, really scared. And after the shutdown, the Daily, at least 20 journalists lost their jobs at the Daily alone. But I'm not talking about other journalists who work with other radio stations.
Okay, great. Yes, sir.
So almost all of the discussion from all three of you has been the written media. What about the digital world? Does that provide a bit of an answer to some of the problems?
No, actually, that's a good question. Cambodia. So the fact that I came here because I want to go back and open my investigative office, and I knew that it's going to be hard for me to get an office, to ask the government for permission to distribute the news or whatever I've got. So my main purpose is to rely on Facebook. But now that Facebook used 5 countries, including Cambodia, as a country that they try a new trend or whatever, so the things that appear on, for example, my friend's Facebook, it's only what I wrote personally about myself. It's not news that I want them to see anymore.
So it's not an easy answer. Right? Good question. Andrew.
First of all, in terms of Cambodia, the history and the bravery that takes place there is just bigger than our heads. It's really amazing for all of us. In the South African and the Uruguayan viewpoints here, you each had sort of a little bit of optimism in it that this will pass, or as long as some of these things are functioning properly, we will see improvement. And in some ways, I wouldn't say it's healthy, but it is this kind of thing that sparks things. How would you rate the American media in its coverage of all of this, of what's going on?
Me or Daniel?
I'll start with you and then we'll go down the road.
I think there's very good things being done here. It's kind of, I'm not sure I can rate it because I'm not sure I'm the right person to do that. But
you're a good person.
Also, I've seen some examples of some of the same mistakes some of the media have done in Latin America at least, which is going up in the ring with the government and using the same tools and trying to get into a fight. And I think that's a mistake because in the long run, as I said, once you lose your credibility, you have nothing. And you cannot fight with a government on the same level. You have to realize that your role is different and that you cannot get into that same muddy waters with them. I'm not sure I can translate it, but there's an expression in Spanish that you don't get into a mud fight with a.
I know it this one, and I've seen that on people's
Mud
walls.
fight with a.
Don't get in. Never wrestle with a pig. You both get covered with mud and shit, and the pig loves every minute of it.
Say it in Spanish. I want to hear it in Spanish.
Is that the translation?
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Daniel.
So one thing that kind of concerns me is that this ubiquity of cable news and just the partisan talk shows and talking heads that just roll. Because I think a lot of people get the information there, and you really fall within one of 2 categories: MSNBC or Fox News, or kind of somewhere in the middle. That's the one side. On the other side, I think the kind of investigative journalism that I've been exposed to and seen being done in this country has been really invigorating and incredible, and something that we can learn from. You know, a diversity of the kinds of investigations that you can do, right down from things affecting people right, at street level, to the kind of stuff that Robert Mueller and the Russians stuff's happening. So I think there's optimism, but I think there's scope for this massive audience that you have through cable news to be engaged better, and for there to be more kind of critical reporting as opposed to this overflow of opinion, which can only go so far in terms of informing.
One last question. Does anybody have one?
Yeah.
Okay, you've got it.
This is for Martin, actually. You mentioned Venezuela, and I just wanted to know the current administration and what is going on, the economic problems in Venezuela. How has the media covered that?
Problem is that in Venezuela now there's almost no media, independent media, or I wouldn't say independent, but any critical media with the government. And the only newspaper I know that's still trying to do that, which is El Nacional, they don't allow them to import paper. They make their life really miserable. And also, in the context of the huge economic crisis that there is in Venezuela now, a journalist in Venezuela makes $20 a month, right? And they have to put up with, when I was in Venezuela, which was like 6 or 7 years ago, in the newspaper, they had to have like armed guards, and they would come, they have these groups of paramilitary people that would come and throw like bags full of human shit to the doors. I mean, you have to work under a very, very complicated position there. So I think that what they are trying to do now is survive, and like any Venezuelan, that's why there's a huge migration process going on, and people are running away to any country, even to Uruguay, which is a lot to say.
Spring is in the air. It's springtime. You ended your presentation with a quote about rain and the hope that's there. Can you remember what that was that you were saying towards the end?
Every time it rained, it eventually stopped.
So to me, what the hope that I take away from a great session like this is standing right here in front of you. As long as we have great, brave journalists from these countries, and there's many more out here, there is hope. You have not come to America to get the answers, and it's time that we listen to you to try to get the answers. But give us a round of applause. We really appreciate it. We invite all of you to join us on the 27th day of April in the afternoon, and invitations will be coming out. That's when the Humphrey Fellows will officially graduate this year, and then move on to some great professional affiliations. And but treasure your time that you've got left within the next 2 or 3 months. Thanks again for joining us, and for
Thank you so much.
Alma and Jan for making all the arrangements, including a few more cookies.
Thanks for the important translation.
That was great.
It was on a wall in my attorney's office.
What's his name? Norman what?
Yeah.